Nobody survives Apollo's cell. Not trainers, not handlers, not anyone. This American Pitbull hospitalized everyone who tried, and his Mafia boss kept him chained in a reinforced prison because $250,000 weapons don't get second chances. But when Reese heard a specific whine through that steel door, 3 short pants, pause, anxious exhale, she broke every rule and walked straight into the kill zone. What she did next wasn't training or magic. She sang a lullaby from 7 years ago, and the monster melted, because this wasn't Vance's dog at all. He'd been stolen, and she'd finally found him. The American Pitbull had hospitalized 2 professional dog trainers and put a former military canine handler in therapy within his first 6 weeks at the estate. The veterinarian who'd attempted his initial examination still had nerve damage in his left hand from the encounter. Even Vance himself approached the dog with calculated caution, treating the animal less like a pet and more like a loaded weapon that happened to breathe. Reese Mitchell learned about the 3rd rule approximately 45 seconds before she broke it. She'd been hired as the new maid just 3 days prior, her arms loaded with fresh towels as she navigated the marble corridor of the East Wing on her 2nd morning shift. The senior maid's warning, Doris, a woman whose iron gray hair and no-nonsense demeanor suggested she'd survived worse than dangerous dogs, still hung in the air like a death sentence. That door stays locked for a reason, girl. The beast behind it cost Mr. Vance $250,000 at some illegal auction 2 years ago. Things got a taste for violence that makes the boss look merciful by comparison. The words had barely settled when a sound erupted from behind the reinforced steel door ahead, like grinding metal mixed with animalistic fury, the kind of noise that bypassed rational thought and triggered every survival instinct evolution had encoded into human DNA. Reese froze, watching the door shudder violently against its frame as something massive threw its weight against the barrier with enough force to make the hinges scream. The lock mechanisms groaned under repeated impacts that seemed impossible for any living creature to sustain without shattering bones or rupturing organs. Jesus Christ, Doris muttered, her weathered hand gripping Reese's elbow hard enough to bruise. He's having one of his episodes. We need to clear this wing. Now. But Reese couldn't move. Her feet had rooted to the polished marble floor, her entire body locked in a paralysis that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with something she couldn't name yet. Some instinct screaming beneath her conscious awareness that this moment mattered, that whatever was happening behind that door would change everything. The crashes stopped abruptly, replaced by something infinitely worse. If you've ever felt invisible, been told you take up too much space, or had someone make you feel like you're too much or not enough, this story is for you. Hit that subscribe button right now and comment where you're watching from. We're building a family of people who refuse to shrink anymore. Absolute silence that felt predatory, calculated. As if whatever lived behind that door had suddenly become aware of their presence and was now listening with the focused intensity of an apex predator evaluating prey. Reese's fingers tightened on the towels. Her heartbeat suddenly thunderous in her ears, so loud she was certain the thing behind the door could hear it, could track her location by the frantic rhythm alone. Then came a sound she hadn't heard in 7 years. But what he didn't know was that someone was watching. A specific pattern of breathing. 3 short, anxious pants followed by a pause, then a longer exhale that ended in a low, distinctive whine. Not aggressive, not threatening, but anxious, seeking, almost desperate. The towels tumbled from her numb hands, cascading to the floor in a waterfall of white terry cloth that she didn't even register hitting the ground. "You all right?" Doris's voice seemed to come from very far away, muffled and distorted as if Reese were suddenly underwater. "Girl, you look like you've seen a ghost." But Reese was already moving toward the door, her body operating on instinct that overrode common sense, self-preservation, and every warning Doris had delivered with such grave certainty. The breathing pattern repeated. 3 short pants. Pause. Longer exhale ending in that same whine. Higher pitched at the end. Almost a question. The exact sound her puppy had made when he was anxious or seeking comfort in the cramped studio apartment she'd shared with her grandmother. "What are you doing?" Doris's voice pitched higher, genuine panic replacing her usual stern composure. "Are you insane? That animal will tear you apart before you can scream." "I've seen what he did to the last person who got too close. One wrong move and everything would fall apart." But Reese's hand had already found the door handle, her fingers trembling as 7 years of grief, desperate hope, and impossible recognition collided in her chest with enough force to steal her breath. Her mind was screaming that this was crazy, that dogs didn't survive 7 years in the underground fighting circuit, that the mathematics of coincidence didn't allow for stolen puppies to end up in Mafia boss mansions, that she was about to die for a delusion born from unresolved trauma. But her body knew. Her body recognized that specific anxiety whine the same way mothers recognize their babies' cries in crowded rooms, the same way twins felt each other's pain across continents, the same way some knowledge transcended logic and lived in the marrow of bones. "Don't you dare!" Doris lunged for her, but Reese was already turning the lock, her fingers working the mechanisms with trembling urgency. The locks clicked open with a finality that felt like crossing a threshold from which there was no return, like stepping off a cliff with no certainty of landing or flight, just the absolute commitment to the fall. That moment, everything in the room changed. The door swung inward to reveal a space that resembled a maximum security prison cell more than any dog's quarters. Reinforced concrete walls painted institutional gray. Scratch marks gouged deep into custom steel paneling, some of them looking fresh enough to have been made within the last hour. A massive American Pitbull chained to an industrial bolt sunk into the reinforced floor with enough steel to anchor a small boat. The dog's head snapped toward her with predatory speed, his lips pulling back from teeth designed to crush windpipes and snap bones like kindling. He was enormous, easily 90 pounds of pure muscle and controlled aggression, every inch of him radiating the kind of danger that made professional handlers demand hazard pay. His coat was steel gray and white, the muscular build so pronounced it looked like he'd been carved from marble by someone who understood violence as an art form. The characteristic white blaze down his chest was broader than she remembered, matured from puppy softness to adult intimidation. Scars crisscrossed his shoulders and neck, some old and silvered, others pink and recent. Evidence of fights he'd survived or been forced into. His ears had been cropped into aggressive points by someone who'd understood his value as a weapon, giving him the appearance of a demon rendered in flesh and fury. But it was the small notch in his left ear that made her knees buckle, a tiny imperfection from when he'd gotten tangled in a chain-link fence at 12 weeks old, requiring careful extraction and leaving that distinctive mark she'd kissed 1,000 times. There was one detail everyone missed. "Apollo," she whispered, and the name felt like resurrection, like speaking life back into something she'd mourned as dead and buried. The dog's snarl faltered, his massive head tilting with confusion that would have been almost comical if not for the very real danger radiating from every tense muscle. His dark eyes, intelligent and wounded in ways that made her chest ache, locked onto hers with something that looked almost like recognition. Behind her, Doris was shouting for security, her voice panicked and distant, already running down the hallway with the kind of speed that suggested she'd seen what Apollo did to people who entered his space uninvited. But Reese couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything except stare at the impossible reunion unfolding in this gilded cage. She'd searched for 6 months after the theft, posting flyers in every neighborhood, calling every shelter within a 100-mile radius, spending money she didn't have on a private investigator who'd ultimately found nothing. The search had consumed her until her grandmother's sudden stroke had redirected all her energy into hospital visits and then hospice care, and then funeral arrangements that she'd paid for with credit cards she was still drowning in. And now here he was, Her Apollo. Scarred and brutalized, and turned into something the world feared, but alive. Breathing. Real. But this wasn't even the most shocking part. The pit bull took one step forward, his chain rattling with the movement, his nose working to process her scent across the 15 feet separating them. Whatever he found there made his entire body language shift from attack ready to something more complex. Confusion mixing with an instinct he couldn't quite name, couldn't quite trust after 2 years of conditioning that had taught him violence was the only language that mattered. Somewhere in the mansion's depths, footsteps were approaching at a run. Multiple sets, heavy boots on marble, the sound of security responding to Doris's alarm. But Reese was already sinking to her knees on the cold concrete floor, her voice breaking as she began to hum the lullaby her grandmother had taught her when Reese was 6, and Apollo was an 8-week-old puppy who'd been terrified of thunderstorms. The melody emerged broken and rough, 7 years of grief and guilt sharpening its edges. But the core remained unchanged. A simple Irish lullaby her great-grandmother had carried across an ocean, the same one Reese had sung to Apollo through fireworks and thunderstorms, and the general anxiety of puppyhood in a chaotic world. Her voice cracked on the third note, tears blurring her vision as she watched Apollo's massive body go completely still. His ears rotated forward with laser focus, the aggressive tension draining from his shoulders in a way that seemed to defy everything she'd been told about his violent conditioning. The chain went slack as he sat back on his haunches, his enormous head tilting with canine bewilderment that looked foreign on an animal trained to kill. She continued humming through her tears, muscle memory guiding her through verses she hadn't sung since the morning she'd woken up to find her apartment balcony gate cut open and Apollo gone. Stolen by professionals who'd left no trace except the absence that had carved a hole through her chest. From here on, the rules of the game changed. Apollo's tail moved once. A tentative sweep against the concrete that looked almost obscene on an animal whose reputation was built on savagery. His mouth closed, the display of teeth replaced by something softer, almost vulnerable, as if layers of brutal conditioning were peeling away with each note she hummed. What the hell is happening? The voice came from the doorway, male, carrying the kind of authority that expected immediate answers and had never been denied them. Deep and controlled, the voice of someone who commanded empires and expected obedience like other people expected oxygen. Step away from that dog, right now. Reese couldn't turn, couldn't risk breaking whatever fragile connection was rebuilding between them. This gossamer thread that felt like the only real thing in a world that had spent 7 years proving itself cruel and arbitrary. She transitioned from humming to soft words, the lullaby's lyrics flowing in the mixture of English and Irish her grandmother had taught her. Purely phonetic memory from childhood carrying her through verses whose meaning she'd never fully understood, but whose sound had always meant safety, meant home, meant love. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for family. Apollo rose slowly, his movements careful rather than aggressive, and began walking toward her with the chain dragging behind him like the ghost of everything he'd been forced to become. Each step was measured, cautious, as if he was approaching something sacred he couldn't quite believe existed. I said, "Step away." The command was sharper now, closer, the voice of someone unused to being ignored. That animal is extremely dangerous. But still Reese remained frozen on her knees, her hands extending palm up in invitation as Apollo closed the distance to 10 feet. Then 8. Then 6. She could see the scars more clearly now, evidence of the fights he'd survived, the abuse he'd endured, the life that had nothing to do with the gentle puppy who'd once fallen asleep in her lap while she studied for her GED. Rage flickered through her grief, hot and sudden and consuming, at whoever had done this to him, at whoever had stolen him and broken him and turned him into something the world feared instead of loved. This choice would define the rest of his life. Apollo stopped 2 feet away, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his massive body. could see the way his ribcage expanded with each careful breath. His nose extended toward her hands, nostrils flaring as he processed scent markers that shouldn't exist, that contradicted everything his violent world had taught him about humans and pain and survival. The first touch of his wet nose against her palm sent electricity through her entire body. 7 years of grief and guilt and desperate hope discharging in a single moment of contact. His eyes, dark brown and intelligent beyond any animal she'd encountered since, carrying wounds that went deeper than the scars on his body, locked onto hers with recognition that transcended training or conditioning, or the violence that had tried to erase everything soft in him. "That's impossible!" The male voice was much quieter now, stripped of command, and replaced with something like wonder, like witnessing a miracle you'd stop believing in. He tried to kill the last person who got within 8 feet of him. Reese's fingers found the notch in Apollo's left ear, tracing the familiar imperfection with trembling gentleness, her touch landing on him with 7 years of accumulated love compressed into a single moment. Apollo's entire body leaned into the touch, a sound emerging from deep in his chest that was neither growl nor whine, but something closer to relief, to recognition, to coming home after being lost in a wilderness that had tried to destroy everything gentle in him. "I know," Reese whispered, her voice breaking on the words as she finally looked up at the man in the doorway. Tall, tattooed, dark-haired, and staring at her like she'd just performed an act of magic that violated every law of his carefully controlled universe. "I know you did, baby. But you're safe now. I found you. I finally found you." And Apollo, the savage, uncontrollable weapon that had made grown men fear for their lives, pressed his scarred head against Reese's chest and made the same soft, relieved sound he'd made as a puppy when she'd come home from work and picked him up, back when the world was still small enough to feel safe and love hadn't yet proven itself breakable. He knew something that no one else in the building did. Behind them, Vance stood frozen in the doorway, watching his most dangerous asset become someone's lost puppy, and understanding with absolute clarity that his carefully ordered world had just been completely, irrevocably shattered by a maid who'd done the impossible. She'd reached past the violence and found the heart he'd stopped believing existed. Doris's fingers dug into Reese's arm hard enough to leave bruises, her weathered face gone pale beneath the harsh fluorescent lighting of the East Wing corridor. "Girl, I'm not asking. I'm telling you to walk away from that door right now. I've worked for Mr. Vance for 12 years, and I've never seen him lose control except once. The day Apollo put Marcus Chen in the ICU for getting too close during feeding time." But Reese's hand was already on the lock mechanism, her fingers working the heavy-duty bolts with trembling urgency that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with 7 years of unresolved grief, suddenly crystallizing into terrible, impossible hope. The breathing pattern came again from behind the steel. 3 short pants. Pause. That distinctive, anxious whine that ended on a higher pitch, almost a question. The exact sound her puppy had made when thunderstorms rolled through their neighborhood, and he'd needed her to tell him the world wasn't ending. "You don't understand," Reese whispered, her voice cracking. "That sound. I understand you're about to get yourself killed on your 2nd day of work," Doris hissed, already backing away, already calculating her distance from whatever violence was about to unfold. "That animal is not a pet. He's a weapon that Mr. Vance paid $250,000 for. He's hospitalized trained professionals. Whatever you think you hear, it's not worth dying for." But the real question was, who planned it? But the final bolt clicked open, and Reese was pulling the door inward before her rational mind could override the instinct screaming through her nervous system. The space beyond looked like something designed by someone who understood that beauty and brutality could coexist. Reinforced concrete walls painted a soft gray that probably cost more per gallon than Reese made in a week. recessed lighting that provided perfect visibility while avoiding harsh shadows. Custom steel panels bolted over what had probably once been elegant wood paneling, now gouged with scratch marks so deep they'd carved through the metal in places. And in the center of it all, chained to an industrial bolt sunk into reinforced concrete, was Apollo. Except he wasn't Apollo anymore. Not the soft, clumsy puppy who'd tripped over his own paws and needed help climbing onto her bed. This was something else entirely. 90 pounds of sculpted muscle and barely contained violence. Every inch of him radiating the kind of danger that made Reese's hindbrain scream at her to run. His head snapped toward her with predatory speed, lips pulling back from teeth that looked designed for maximum damage. A growl emerged from deep in his chest, low and continuous, the sound of a creature that had learned to kill and been rewarded for it. He couldn't explain why, but danger was closing in. But Reese couldn't move. Her feet had rooted to the concrete floor, her entire body locked in a paralysis that had nothing to do with the very real threat in front of her, and everything to do with cataloging every detail, searching for proof that her impossible recognition was real and not some grief-induced delusion. He was massive. The 8-week-old puppy who'd fit in her arms had become something that looked like it could tear through reinforced doors given enough motivation. His coat was steel gray and white, the coloring she remembered but matured into something more intimidating. The white blaze down his chest was broader, more pronounced, the kind of marking that would make him stand out in any crowd. Scars crisscrossed his shoulders and flanks, some old and silvered, others pink and recent. Evidence of fights he'd survived, battles he'd been forced into. A life of violence that had nothing to do with the gentle creature who'd once fallen asleep in her lap while she studied. His ears had been cropped into aggressive points, giving him the appearance of something demonic, rendered in flesh and fury. The cartilage had healed in sharp angles that emphasized threat over anything soft or approachable. Behind her, Doris was running down the hallway, her footsteps echoing off marble as she went to sound whatever alarm would bring security, or Vance himself or anyone who could stop the tragedy she was certain was about to unfold. Apollo took a step forward, his chain rattling with the movement, every muscle in his powerful body coiled and ready. His dark eyes, intelligent and wounded in ways that made Reese's chest physically ache, locked onto hers with an intensity that felt almost human in its focus. She forced herself to breathe, to look past the violence and the scars and the teeth designed to crush bone, to search for any trace of the puppy she'd loved with the kind of desperate, uncomplicated devotion only possible before the world teaches you that everything you love can be taken. His nose was working, processing her scent across the 15 feet of space between them. Whatever he found there made something shift in his body language, confusion bleeding into the aggression, creating a tension that looked almost painful in its complexity. Hidden in the files was a secret that could destroy them all. Then Reese saw it, the white marking on his chest. She'd thought it was just the breed's natural coloring, but as he moved closer, cautious, predatory, every step measured, the light hit it differently, and she saw the pattern that had always reminded her of a lightning bolt, slightly crooked, wider at the top than the bottom. The exact shape she'd traced with her fingers 1,000 times while he slept. Her knees buckled, hitting the concrete hard enough to send jolts of pain through her legs that she barely registered. Because there, on the broad white expanse of his chest, partially hidden by the massive muscle development that came from 2 years of fighting and forced exercise, was the marking that proved everything. Not just the lightning bolt shape, but within it, barely visible unless you knew to look for it, a small darker patch that formed an almost perfect triangle. A marking so subtle that most people would never notice it. A detail she'd discovered when he was 12 weeks old and had memorized because it felt like a secret only they shared. What she found in the envelope froze her in place. "Apollo," she whispered. and this time the name didn't feel like hope or delusion or desperate reaching. It felt like truth. It felt like finding something she'd mourned as dead and discovering it had been alive all along, suffering without her, surviving without her, waiting without knowing what it was waiting for. 7 years of suppressed grief hit her all at once. The guilt of not protecting him, the shame of giving up the search when her grandmother got sick, the rage at whoever had cut through her balcony lock and stolen the one thing that made her cramped studio apartment feel like home. Apollo's growl had faded to something uncertain. His massive head tilted, ears rotating forward as he processed her voice, her scent, the impossible familiarity of something he couldn't consciously remember but that his body recognized anyway. And Reese, kneeling on cold concrete in a mansion she couldn't afford to rent a closet in, staring at a dog who'd been turned into a weapon worth more than she'd earn in 5 years, felt 7 years of carefully constructed emotional walls collapse into rubble. "I'm sorry," she choked out, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry I didn't find you sooner." He realized he wasn't alone. Someone else had arrived. The sound of boots on marble was getting closer. Heavy, purposeful, the footfalls of security personnel responding to an emergency. Reese could hear Doris's voice rising above the footsteps, shrill with panic, explaining that the new maid had lost her mind and entered the dog's quarters and was about to be torn apart. But Reese couldn't move, couldn't stand, couldn't do anything except sink further onto her knees and let the grief she'd been carrying for 7 years finally escape. Apollo watched her with an intensity that felt almost human, his dark eyes tracking every movement, every tear that fell, as if he was trying to solve an equation that didn't make sense within the brutal mathematics of his current world. His chain rattled as he took another step closer, closing the distance to 10 feet. Then 8. Each movement careful, controlled, nothing like the explosive violence she'd been warned about. Her next words hit him harder than any bullet. Reese's grandmother had taught her the lullaby when Reese was 6 years old, barely old enough to carry a tune, but desperate to help calm the new puppy they'd rescued from the shelter. The melody was Irish, passed down through generations of women who'd used it to soothe children and animals alike, through storms both literal and metaphorical. Her voice emerged broken at first, cracking on the opening notes, roughened by tears and 7 years of not singing anything that reminded her of what she'd lost. But muscle memory took over, guiding her through verses she'd sung so many times they'd worn grooves into her neural pathways. "Slumber, my darling. The birds are at rest. The wandering dews by the flowers are caressed." The Irish words felt foreign on her tongue after so long, but her grandmother's pronunciation lessons had been thorough enough that phonetic memory carried her through even when conscious thought failed. What followed next was completely unexpected. Apollo's entire body went rigid, his ears rotated forward with laser focus, every muscle freezing mid-movement as if someone had hit pause on a video. The aggressive tension that had been coiled through his shoulders and haunches began to drain away like water finding cracks in concrete. Reese continued, her voice growing steadier even as tears continued to streak down her face, blurring her vision until Apollo became a dark silhouette against gray walls. "Slumber, my darling. I'll wrap thee up warm, and pray that the angels will shield thee from harm." The chain went completely slack. Apollo sat back on his haunches, his massive head tilting with the kind of bewildered confusion that would have been comical if Reese's heart wasn't breaking with every note she sang. She could see him fighting it. The conditioning that had taught him violence was the only language that mattered, warring against something deeper, something primal that recognized this melody as safety, as home, as the sound that had once meant he was loved unconditionally. His mouth closed, the display of teeth disappearing as his jaw relaxed. The continuous growl that had been emanating from his chest faded to nothing, replaced by breathing that sounded almost peaceful. Reese transitioned to the second verse, The one her grandmother had always said was the most important. The one that promised protection and safety even when the world outside was chaos. In that moment, the entire balance of power flipped. Apollo's tail moved. Just once. A tentative sweep against the concrete floor that looked obscene on an animal whose reputation was built on savagery and controlled violence. The movement was rusty, unpracticed, as if his body had forgotten how to express anything other than aggression and was relearning the language of something softer. Slumber, my darling, till morn's blushing ray brings to the world the glad tidings of day. Behind her, the footsteps had stopped. Reese could sense the presence of multiple people in the doorway. Security, probably Doris, maybe others drawn by the commotion. But no one was moving. No one was intervening. They were all frozen, watching something that shouldn't be possible. Apollo rose slowly from his sitting position and took 3 more careful steps forward, bringing him close enough that Reese could feel the heat radiating from his massive body, could see the way his ribcage expanded with each breath, could count the scars that crisscrossed his shoulders and neck, his nose extended toward her, nostrils flaring as he processed her scent with the same focused intensity he'd probably used to identify threats in whatever fighting rings he'd survived. But this time, the recognition wasn't triggering aggression. It was triggering something else entirely. Memory. Recognition. The ghost of a bond that violence and time and distance had tried to erase but hadn't quite managed to destroy. Reese held perfectly still, continuing the lullaby even as her voice cracked with emotion, letting him come to her on his own terms, at his own pace, making the choice that professional trainers and handlers had tried to force. For the first time, he wasn't in control. Apollo's wet nose touched her outstretched palm, and electricity shot through her entire body. 7 years of guilt and grief and desperate searching compressed into a single point of contact. His eyes, dark brown and intelligent beyond any animal she'd encountered, carrying wounds that went far deeper than the physical scars mapping his body, locked onto hers with recognition that transcended training or conditioning, or the brutal education he'd received in violence. Fill my fond heart with such rapture and bliss. Angels could give me no more than this. Reese finished the final verse, her voice barely a whisper now, as Apollo's entire body leaned into her touch. The sound that emerged from deep in his chest wasn't a growl or a whine, but something in between. Relief and recognition, and a grief that mirrored her own. His tail wagged again, more confident this time. Still tentative, still rusty, but undeniable. The movement of a dog who was remembering what it felt like to be loved instead of feared, to be someone's companion instead of someone's weapon. If someone who truly listens and keeps their promises is already making you emotional like it is me, hit that subscribe button and join our family. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Let's stand together for every person and every animal that's been told they're worthless. Jesus Christ, someone breathed from the doorway. Male voice, deep, carrying the kind of authority that suggested this was someone used to being obeyed without question. That's not possible. That's not... He tried to kill Marcus for getting within 8 feet. But Reese couldn't respond. Couldn't turn away from Apollo, who was pressing his scarred head against her chest now, making the same soft sound he'd made as a 12-week-old puppy when she'd come home from her shift at the diner and picked him up, back when the world was still small enough to feel safe. Her arms came up around his massive neck, fingers finding familiar spots despite the muscle and scars that hadn't existed when he was small enough to carry. The notch in his left ear, the slightly raised line of tissue on his shoulder from an injury she couldn't identify. The way his breathing slowed when she scratched behind his ears in just the right spot. Apollo's entire body shuddered, as if years of tension were finally releasing all at once. His tail continued its tentative wagging, each sweep becoming more confident. More like the enthusiastic movements she remembered from before the world had taught him that love was a weakness and violence was survival. And Reese held him, this weapon worth $250,000, this savage beast that made grown men fear for their lives, and felt him transform back into her puppy, broken and scarred and traumatized, but still hers, still capable of remembering what it felt like to be safe. "Step away from the dog." The command came with the kind of authority that expected immediate compliance, but Reese couldn't make her body obey. Her arms were still wrapped around Apollo's massive neck, her face buried in his fur that smelled like expensive dog shampoo and something darker underneath. Old fear. Old pain. The scent of violence that had soaked into him until it became part of his identity. "Ma'am, I'm not going to ask again. That animal is extremely dangerous." "He's not," Reese said, her voice muffled against Apollo's shoulder. "He's scared and hurt and traumatized, but he's not dangerous, not to me." Someone in the room was lying. But who? Footsteps approached, measured and controlled. Reese finally pulled back from Apollo, keeping one hand on his neck, feeling his pulse strong and steady beneath scarred skin, and looked up at the man who'd entered the room. Vance was exactly what she'd expected from a man who ran an empire built on fear and money. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a custom suit that probably cost more than her car. Dark hair styled with casual precision. Tattoos visible at his neck and wrists, the kind of ink that spoke of affiliations and history rather than aesthetic choice. His face was angular and hard, the face of someone who'd made difficult decisions and lived with the consequences without losing sleep. But his eyes, dark and intelligent and currently locked on the impossible scene in front of him, held something she hadn't expected. Genuine shock. The expression of someone watching their understanding of reality fracture in real time. "Who the hell are you?" His voice was quieter now, controlled, but carrying an edge that suggested violence was always an option, just waiting for the right justification. "Reese Mitchell. I was hired 3 days ago. Housekeeping staff." She kept her voice steady, even though her heart was hammering hard enough to make her dizzy. "And this is Apollo. My Apollo." Vance's eyes narrowed. Behind him, security personnel had spread out in a tactical formation, each one watching Apollo with the kind of wary respect usually reserved for loaded weapons. Doris was visible in the doorway, her face pale, one hand pressed to her chest as if she were having a cardiac event. He trusted her, and that was his biggest mistake. "You're Apollo," Vance repeated, his tone suggesting he was testing the words for sanity. "The dog I paid $250,000 for at an underground auction 2 years ago is somehow your dog." "Yes. That's an interesting claim." He took a step closer, and immediately 3 security guards moved with him, hands going to weapons Reese couldn't see but could sense. "Especially considering you were hired 72 hours ago through a standard employment agency. Which means either you're delusional, or this is an elaborate con, or someone stole my puppy 7 years ago and sold him into the fighting circuit and he's been passed from handler to handler until he ended up here." Reese's voice gained strength, anger bleeding through the grief and shock. "Someone cut through the lock on my balcony while I slept and took the only thing I had left after my parents died. Someone turned a 3-month-old puppy into this." Apollo pressed closer to her, as if sensing her distress, his massive body providing warmth and solid reality in a situation that felt increasingly surreal. Vance studied her with the kind of focus that suggested he'd built his empire on reading people accurately. "The dog I bought was already fully trained, aggressive, violent, worth every penny because he was uncontrollable enough to be a deterrent and controlled enough to be useful." "You're telling me that animal was once a puppy you owned?" He didn't realize this moment would come back to haunt him. "I'm not telling you. I'm showing you." Reese gently guided Apollo's head up, her fingers finding the spot on his muzzle where the scar lived. "Look, right here. See this line?" Vance moved closer, slowly, his eyes never leaving Apollo even as the dog remained calm under Reese's touch. He knelt down, bringing himself to eye level with the scar she was indicating. It was small, barely visible under the short fur. A thin white line about an inch long, running at an angle across Apollo's muzzle just below his left nostril. "He got this when he was 4 months old," Reese said quietly. "I was broke, barely making rent, and I'd just bought him the cheapest dog food I could find. He ate it so fast he made himself sick. And when he tried to vomit, he stumbled and hit his face on the corner of my coffee table. The cut was deep enough that I should have taken him to a vet, but I couldn't afford it. So I cleaned it and bandaged it and prayed it wouldn't get infected." She traced the scar with one finger, and Apollo leaned into the touch, his eyes closing briefly. "It took 2 weeks to heal. Left this scar. I used to kiss it and tell him it made him look tough." Her voice cracked. "I never thought he'd actually become the thing I joked about." Vance stared at the scar, then at Reese, then back at Apollo. His expression was carefully neutral, but something was shifting behind his eyes. Calculations being made, realities being adjusted. "Anyone could have noticed that scar," he said, but his tone suggested he didn't believe his own objection. "Could they notice this?" Reese gently pulled back Apollo's upper lip, revealing his gums. "See that canine tooth? The one that's slightly shorter than the others? He broke it when he was 5 months old, trying to chew through a plastic crate I'd locked him in while I went to work. The emergency vet said it would probably need to be removed eventually, but it never caused him problems. So I left it." Vance leaned closer, examining the tooth. His jaw tightened. Under the floorboard, he discovered a truth he wasn't ready for. "And this," Reese continued, running her hand down Apollo's left foreleg. "Feel right here? That slight bump in the bone? He broke his leg jumping off my bed when he was 6 months old. I couldn't afford the surgery, so the clinic put him in a cast and hoped it would heal straight. It mostly did. But if you know what you're looking for, you can feel where the bone knit back together." Vance's hand moved almost against his will, his fingers finding the spot she'd indicated. His eyes widened slightly as he felt the irregularity in the bone structure. "I didn't tame your dog," Reese said, looking him directly in the eyes, letting him see the 7 years of grief and rage and desperate hope that had brought her to this moment. "I didn't use some magic trick or special technique. I raised him, I loved him, and someone stole him from me and turned him into what you see now." The silence stretched between them, broken only by Apollo's steady breathing and the distant sound of the mansion's climate control system. "I didn't know," Vance finally said, his voice rough. "When I bought him, the seller said he'd been bred and trained specifically for protection work. Said his aggression was genetic, carefully cultivated. I thought I was buying a weapon that happened to breathe." "You bought my puppy," Reese whispered, "and I want him back." This was only the beginning of a much bigger war. Vance's eyes hardened. "That's not how this works. I paid $250,000. "I don't care what you paid." Reese's voice gained strength, fueled by 7 years of suppressed rage finding its target. "He's mine. He was always mine. And I'm not leaving without him." Apollo's tail wagged, responding to the conviction in her voice, and Reese felt something shift in her chest. She'd spent 7 years being a victim, of theft, of grief, of circumstances beyond her control. But looking at Vance, holding Apollo, feeling the solid reality of her puppy returned, she felt something else entirely. Power, purpose, the absolute certainty that she would burn this mansion to the ground before she walked away without Apollo again. Vance must have seen it in her eyes, because his expression shifted from skepticism to something closer to respect. "I didn't tame him," Reese repeated, her voice steel wrapped in silk. "I raised him, and now I'm taking him home." Vance stood slowly, his movements controlled, and for a long moment he simply stared at Reese with the kind of focus that probably made most people confess to crimes they didn't commit. The security personnel hadn't relaxed their positions, hands still near weapons, eyes tracking every movement Apollo made. "You're not taking anything," Vance said finally, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Not until we establish some facts. Starting with the interesting coincidence of you being hired exactly 72 hours before this reunion." Reese's hand tightened on Apollo's neck, feeling his pulse quicken as if he sensed the rising tension. "It's not a coincidence. I've been applying to every estate, every mansion, every wealthy household in this city for the past 8 months, because I finally saved enough money to hire someone to track down the auction records." He thought it was over, until he noticed something strange. And I found 3 possibles. 3 American Pitbulls sold through underground auctions in the right time frame with similar descriptions. Yours was one of them. She met his gaze without flinching. "I couldn't exactly knock on your door and ask to see your dog, so I applied for work. Got lucky that you were hiring." Vance's jaw tightened. Lucky. That's an interesting word for infiltrating my home under false pretenses. "I didn't lie about my qualifications. I can clean. I show up on time. I don't ask questions about blood on shirts or midnight meetings." Reese's voice hardened. "I just needed to get close enough to know for sure." "And now you know." Vance pulled out his phone, scrolled through something, then turned the screen toward her. "This is what I paid for your puppy." The auction listing made Reese's stomach turn. Apollo's photo, scarred, aggressive, teeth bared, with a description that read like a weapons catalog. Fully trained protection dog. Extreme aggression. Uncontrollable by standard methods. Ideal for high-security applications. Previous kills, 4 confirmed. Price, $250,000. Something didn't add up, and the truth was darker than he expected. "Previous kills," Reese whispered, feeling like she might vomit. "They made him a killer." Yes. Vance's expression was unreadable. "Whatever he was when you knew him, that's not what I bought. I bought a weapon, and weapons aren't returned just because someone claims prior ownership." Apollo whined softly, pressing closer to Reese as if sensing her distress. She buried her face in his fur, breathing through the rage and grief that threatened to overwhelm her. "I'm not asking," she said quietly. "I'm telling you, he's mine, and I will do whatever it takes to get him back." Threats. Vance's voice held something that might have been amusement if the situation weren't so tense. "From a maid who makes $15 an hour against a man who could make you disappear without anyone asking questions. That's bold." "It's not a threat. It's a statement of fact." Reese lifted her head, meeting his eyes. "You can fire me. You can have me arrested for trespassing or whatever legal fiction your lawyers can construct. You can make my life hell, but I'm not walking away from him again. I did that once because I thought he was gone forever. Now I know he's not. So you're going to have to kill me to make me leave, and something tells me that would create complications you don't need." And then, the gun clicked. Silence stretched between them, broken only by Apollo's breathing and the quiet shuffle of security personnel adjusting their positions. Then, inexplicably, Vance laughed. Not a warm sound, nothing about him suggested warmth, but genuine amusement at the absurdity of being threatened by someone who had no power and every reason to be terrified. "You've got spine," he said finally. "Stupid spine, but spine nonetheless." He pocketed his phone. "Here's what's going to happen. You're not taking my dog. I paid for him legally, relatively speaking, and I'm not in the habit of returning purchases just because someone tells a compelling story." Reese opened her mouth to argue, but Vance held up a hand. "However," he continued, "I'm also not in the habit of keeping stolen property if I can verify the theft. So you're going to prove every claim you just made. Medical records, photos, vet bills, whatever documentation exists that shows you owned an American Pitbull puppy 7 years ago. You have 48 hours. And if I prove it? His next decision would decide whether he lived or died. Then we negotiate. Vance's expression was unreadable. Because here's the reality you're not acknowledging. That dog is dangerous. He's killed. He's been conditioned for violence. Whatever sweet puppy you remember is buried under 2 years of fighting ring training. Even if you owned him once, he's not that animal anymore. He recognized me, Reese said quietly. He responded to a lullaby he shouldn't remember. He's still in there, under all the trauma and conditioning. He's still my Apollo. Maybe. Vance's eyes were calculating. Or maybe he just responded to someone who wasn't afraid of him. Either way, I'm not handing over a $250,000 asset without compensation and assurances. What kind of assurances? That you can actually control him. That he won't revert to violence the moment something triggers him. That whatever bond you think you have is strong enough to override years of conditioning. Vance crossed his arms. I'll make you a deal. You work exclusively with Apollo. Triple your current salary. You prove you can handle him, rehabilitate him, make him something other than a liability. And you help me find whoever stole him and sold him into that life. Reese's breath caught. Why would you care who sold him to you? Because I was sold a lie. Vance's voice dropped to something cold and dangerous. I paid top dollar for what I thought was a purpose-bred protection dog. Instead, I bought stolen property that's been traumatized into violence. Someone took my money under false pretenses. I don't tolerate that. But he had no idea a bigger force was controlling everything. So this is about your pride. This is about principle. Vance stepped closer, and Apollo tensed but didn't move from Reese's side. Someone stole from you. Then they stole from me. I want to know who, and I want to make sure they understand that was a mistake. You help me find them, you prove you can handle Apollo, and we'll discuss more permanent arrangements. Reese's mind raced. Triple salary would pay off her grandmother's medical debt in months instead of years. Access to Apollo would let her undo whatever damage had been done. And finding who stole him, making them pay for what they'd done, held an appeal that scared her with its intensity. I have conditions, she said. Vance's eyebrow rose. You're in no position to negotiate. You want me to rehabilitate him. That means full medical care, top veterinarians, whatever treatment he needs for physical and psychological trauma. No expense spared. Done. What else? When we find who stole him, I get to be there. I get to look them in the eye and make sure they know exactly what they took from me. Vance's smile was sharp and cold. I can arrange that, though I should warn you, when I find people who've stolen from me, the consequences tend to be permanent. I'm not asking you to kill anyone. I'm not promising I won't. Vance extended his hand. Do we have a deal? This single decision gave him the upper hand again. Reese looked at his hand, then at Apollo, who was watching her with those intelligent brown eyes that held too much trauma and just enough hope. This was dangerous, binding herself to a man who spoke casually about making people disappear, agreeing to work in a world where violence was currency and loyalty was bought with fear. But Apollo was alive. Apollo was here. And she'd spent 7 years mourning something she thought was lost forever. She placed her hand in Vance's, feeling his grip, firm, controlled. The handshake of someone who never made promises he didn't intend to keep. Deal, she said. But I'm doing this for him, not for you. The moment you become a threat to Apollo, all bets are off. Vance's smile widened. Noted. Now let's see if your puppy remembers how to be something other than a killer. He released her hand and stepped back. And Reese felt the weight of what she'd just agreed to settle over her shoulders like a shroud. She'd made a deal with a devil to save an angel, and she had no idea which of them would ultimately be saved or damned by the arrangement. The East Wing transformed over the following weeks in ways that made the security staff uncomfortable, and Vance's accountant quietly anxious. The prison cell aesthetic, reinforced walls, heavy chains, scratch-marked steel, gave way to something that looked more like rehabilitation than containment. But this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. Reese had demanded and received an orthopedic dog bed large enough for Apollo's massive frame, elevated to help with the joint issues she'd identified during her initial examination. Soft lighting replaced the harsh fluorescence. The chain had been removed entirely, replaced with monitoring cameras that Vance insisted on, but that Reese barely noticed anymore. She'd established routines with the kind of religious precision her grandmother had used for prayer. 6 a.m. feeding, 7 a.m. gentle exercise, walking the perimeter of the East Wing, building trust before attempting anything more ambitious. 8 a.m. grooming, which doubled as physical therapy for muscles that had been conditioned for violence rather than health. Noon feeding, afternoon training sessions focused on basic commands that Apollo had probably once known, but had forgotten under layers of fighting ring conditioning. The evening routine was sacred. Dinner at 6 p.m., followed by quiet time where Reese would sit on the floor and read aloud while Apollo slowly, incrementally, learned to relax in her presence without needing to maintain constant vigilance. Progress was measured in inches rather than miles. The first week, Apollo would only eat if Reese was at least 10 feet away. The second week, he tolerated her presence at 6 feet. By the third week, he was eating from a bowl she held, his massive jaws careful around her fingers, in a way that suggested some part of him remembered that humans could be fragile and worth protecting. He had no idea the night would end in blood. The nightmares were harder to address. Apollo would wake from sleep with violent starts, immediately on his feet, teeth bared, searching for threats that didn't exist in this new, safer world. Reese learned to recognize the signs, the change in breathing, the muscle tension, the small whimpers that preceded the explosive waking, and would start humming the lullaby before he fully surfaced, guiding him back to calm before the fear could fully take hold. She'd discovered the extent of his scars during the first grooming session. Some were surgical, clean lines that spoke of professional veterinary care, probably to keep him fighting ready. Others were jagged, poorly healed, evidence of injuries that had been ignored or inadequately treated. There was a partial ear tear that had healed crooked. A pattern of circular scars on his legs that made her stomach turn because she knew exactly what caused them. Electric shock collars, used to correct behaviors that fighting ring operators considered weaknesses. Like affection, like trust, like any softness that might make him hesitate before attacking. The first time Apollo voluntarily approached her for comfort rather than food, Reese had cried so hard she'd scared him back into wariness. The second time, she'd managed to hold still while he pressed his scarred head against her knee, accepting the gentle scratching behind his ears without flinching. Small victories. Incremental healing. The slow, painstaking work of undoing years of trauma with nothing but patience and stubborn love. He should have walked away, but then he saw it. Vance had stayed away for the first 3 weeks, receiving daily reports from security cameras but never appearing in person. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon during Apollo's training session, he simply walked in. Apollo's reaction was immediate and visceral. Every muscle tensed. His lips pulled back from teeth that could crush bone. A growl emerged from deep in his chest. Not the uncertain sound he'd made when first seeing Reese, but the practiced, controlled sound of an animal that knew exactly how to kill and was calculating the most efficient approach. "Easy," Reese said quietly, positioning herself between Vance and Apollo without making it obvious. "He's not a threat. Sit, Apollo. Sit." Apollo's eyes never left Vance, but his haunches lowered incrementally, obeying the command even as every instinct screamed at him to attack or flee. Vance stopped about 15 feet away, his hands visible and empty, his body language deliberately non-threatening in a way that suggested he'd had training in handling dangerous situations. Impressive. 3 weeks ago, he would have already attacked. 3 weeks ago, he was still operating on fighting ring rules, Reese said, keeping her voice calm, one hand on Apollo's neck to monitor his pulse. He's learning different rules now. Is he? Vance's eyes were sharp, assessing. Or is he just learning to hide his violence better? There's a difference between suppressing violence and unlearning it. And suddenly, he realized he was being played. Semantics that won't matter when he reverts to type and tears someone's throat out. Vance took a casual step forward, and Apollo's growl intensified. You're teaching him vulnerability, Reese. In my world, vulnerability gets you killed. In your world, maybe. But he doesn't have to live in your world anymore. Reese met Vance's gaze without flinching. He can be something other than a weapon. Can he? Another step forward. Apollo's entire body was coiled now, every muscle ready. Or are you projecting what you want him to be onto what he actually is? Stop moving, Reese said quietly. You're triggering his defense protocols. Exactly my point. Vance stopped, but his expression was challenging. The moment he perceives a threat, all your rehabilitation disappears. He's still a killer underneath. You've just put a prettier leash on it. Reese's jaw tightened. She wanted to argue, to prove him wrong, to demonstrate that Apollo was healing, not just performing. But she could feel the tension in Apollo's body, could hear his breathing accelerating, could sense him approaching the threshold where training would fail and instinct would take over. For once, he wasn't thinking like a boss, but like a man about to lose everything. You're not wrong, she admitted quietly. He's not healed. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Not completely, but he's better than he was, and he'll keep getting better if given time and space and patience. Time I'm paying for at triple your salary, Vance pointed out. Space I'm providing in my home. Patience I'm extending despite the liability he represents. Then why are you here? Reese's voice hardened. To remind me that you're in control? To make sure I remember who signs my paychecks? Because I'm very aware, thanks. I'm also aware that you don't actually care about Apollo beyond his value as an asset and his value as leverage over me. Something flickered across Vance's face. Not quite hurt, but something in that territory. You don't know what I care about. I know you talk about him like he's property instead of a living thing that's suffered more than most humans ever will. Reese's hand gentled on Apollo's neck, feeling his pulse slowly calming as Vance stopped advancing. I know you see him as an investment to be rehabilitated or written off, not as what? Your lost puppy? Vance's voice took on an edge. I hate to break this to you, but your puppy died in whatever fighting ring he survived. This is something else now. Something damaged and dangerous and possibly beyond repair. He didn't want revenge. He needed it. Then why haven't you put him down? Reese challenged. If he's such a liability, such a lost cause, why keep paying for his care? Why agree to help me find who stole him? Vance was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes unreadable. Because I don't like loose ends. Because whoever sold me stolen property needs to understand that was a mistake. Because... He stopped, jaw tightening. Because you're right that he suffered. And maybe, despite what you think, I'm not completely heartless about that. The admission hung in the air between them, unexpected and raw. Apollo's growl had faded to nothing. His body was still tense, still wary, but no longer preparing for violence. He was watching Vance with the kind of focused intelligence that suggested he was reassessing, recalculating, determining whether this particular human was a threat or simply present. You're teaching him vulnerability, Vance repeated, but this time the words held something different. Not accusation, something closer to concern. That will get him killed in my world. The moment someone threatens you, the moment he has to choose between violence and hesitation, all this gentle conditioning will mean nothing. Or, Reese said quietly, it will mean he has something worth protecting instead of just something to fear losing. Love doesn't make you weak, Vance. It makes you strong enough to choose what battles are worth fighting. His right-hand man had been hiding something from him. Vance stared at her, and for just a moment, something unguarded crossed his face. Then the mask slammed back into place, controlled and cool and utterly unreadable. "We'll see," he said. "I'll be making these visits more frequently. If he's going to live in my home, he needs to learn to tolerate my presence without threat assessment. Then you need to learn how to approach him without triggering defense protocols," Reese countered. "This isn't a negotiation. Either you respect what I'm doing here, or you stay away until he's ready." Vance's eyebrow rose. "You're giving me ultimatums? In my own home? I'm establishing boundaries, for Apollo's well-being." Reese held his gaze. "You hired me to rehabilitate him. Let me do my job." They stared at each other, wills clashing in the space between them, neither willing to back down. Then Apollo moved. Not toward Reese, where safety and comfort lived. Not away from Vance, where instinct suggested escape was the logical choice. He moved 3 steps forward, closing the distance to Vance to about 10 feet, and sat. Just sat, his massive body taking the posture Reese had been drilling with him for weeks. The position that meant, I'm aware, I'm watching, but I'm not attacking. Vance's eyes widened slightly, genuine surprise breaking through his controlled expression. "He's watching you," Reese said softly, "assessing whether you're a threat. Waiting to see how you respond to his non-aggression." "What should I do?" "Nothing. Just be. Let him see that you can share space without demanding violence or submission." Vance stood very still, and for almost a full minute, man and dog simply regarded each other. Apollo's tail remained motionless, but his ears were forward, engaged rather than defensive. His breathing was steady. His body language suggested wariness but not fear, assessment but not aggression. Finally, Apollo stood, walked back to Reese, and settled at her feet, close enough to touch, but positioned so he could still see Vance. "Progress," Vance said quietly. "Maybe. Definitely," Reese corrected. 3 weeks ago, he would have already attacked. Today, he chose to assess instead. That's not nothing. Vance nodded slowly, something thoughtful crossing his features. "Same time tomorrow. I'll be back. We'll see if he can build on this." "Why?" "Because you're right." Vance's voice was quiet, stripped of the casual authority he usually carried. "He's suffered enough, and if he can be something other than what he was made into, that matters." He left without another word, his footsteps echoing down the marble hallway. Reese looked down at Apollo, who was watching the empty doorway with focused intensity. "Yeah," she whispered, scratching behind his ears. "I don't know what to make of him either." Apollo's tail thumped once against the floor, and Reese chose to interpret that as agreement. Vance returned the next day precisely at 2 p.m., and the day after that, and the day after that, until his afternoon visits became part of Apollo's routine. The first week, he simply sat in a chair Reese had positioned 15 feet from Apollo's bed and read reports on his tablet, occasionally looking up but never engaging. The second week, he started narrating what he was reading: merger proposals, property acquisitions, security briefings, his voice providing a constant, non-threatening presence that let Apollo habituate to his sound. By the third week, Vance was sitting 10 feet away instead of 15, and Apollo no longer tracked his every movement with predatory focus. Everyone thought the deal went smoothly, but they were wrong. "He's learning you're boring," Reese said on the 17th day of visits, unable to suppress a small smile as Apollo actually yawned during Vance's recitation of quarterly earnings. Boring is safe, Vance replied. Boring doesn't trigger fight responses. You've been studying. I've been reading the books you keep leaving strategically around. Vance gestured to the stack of dog psychology and trauma rehabilitation texts Reese had assembled. Figured if I'm investing this much time, I should understand what I'm watching. It was a Thursday afternoon when Reese decided to push the next boundary. Apollo had been calm all day, his body language suggesting one of his better days. Alert, but relaxed. Engaged, but not vigilant. Vance was in his usual position, reading through something that involved enough technical jargon to make Reese's eyes glaze over when she'd glanced at the screen. I want to teach you how to approach him, Reese said, interrupting Vance mid-sentence about leveraged buyouts. Vance looked up, eyes sharp. Is that advisable? Probably not, but if he's going to live here long-term, he needs to see you as something other than a threat he tolerates. And if he decides mid-approach that I'm actually a threat he should eliminate, then I'll intervene. Reese's voice was confident in a way that suggested she'd thought this through. But I don't think he will. He's been watching you for 3 weeks. He's seen you be predictable, non-threatening, boring. His threat assessment has downgraded from kill on sight to watch carefully. That's enough to try. But there was one thing he didn't know about his closest ally. Vance closed his tablet slowly. You're the expert. What do I do? First, you're going to take off your jacket and your watch. Why? Because they're armor. They're signifiers of status and power. Apollo doesn't care about your net worth or your reputation. He cares about threat and safety. You need to communicate safety, and that means stripping away the things that make you dangerous. Vance hesitated, then shrugged out of his custom suit jacket, revealing the shoulder holster he wore like a second skin. Reese's eyebrow rose. The gun stays in the jacket, on the other side of the room. That's not happening. Then neither is this. Reese crossed her arms. You're not approaching a traumatized animal while armed. That's non-negotiable. They stared at each other, wills clashing again. Then Vance sighed, removed the holster, and placed it with his jacket on a chair near the door. The watch too, Reese said. It's a Patek Philippe, probably worth more than my car. It's a symbol of wealth and power. Take it off. Vance's jaw tightened, but he removed the watch, setting it beside the holster. Now what? Now you're going to kneel. I don't kneel. What she said next shattered his trust instantly. You do if you want Apollo to see you as safe. Reese's voice was patient but firm. Dogs read height as dominance. You're already tall and physically intimidating. Kneeling makes you smaller, less threatening. It's a signal that you're not using your size to dominate. This is ridiculous. This is necessary. Reese moved to Apollo, who was watching the interaction with focused attention. You're asking him to trust you. Trust is earned through vulnerability, not power. So yes, you're going to kneel. You're going to make yourself smaller. You're going to show him that you're willing to be vulnerable in his presence. Vance's expression was stony, but he slowly lowered himself to one knee, then both, his movements controlled and clearly uncomfortable with the position. Good. Now breathe. Slow, steady breaths. Not the controlled breathing of someone maintaining composure, but the relaxed breathing of someone who's actually calm. I am calm. You're in control. That's different. Control suggests threat management. Calm suggests safety. Reese's voice was gentle but unyielding. Let go of the control. Just for a few minutes. Let yourself actually feel calm instead of performing it. Vance closed his eyes, and Reese watched as he consciously loosened the rigid posture he maintained like armor. His shoulders dropped incrementally, his jaw unclenched. His breathing shifted from measured to natural. Better, Reese said. Now keep your hands visible and relaxed, not reaching, not demanding, Just present. You're not asking him for anything. You're just existing in his space, allowing him to make choices about engagement. Apollo was watching intently, his head tilted in that way that suggested canine confusion. This version of Vance, stripped of weapons and expensive symbols, kneeling instead of towering, breathing calmly instead of radiating controlled threat, didn't match his established pattern. If you're standing with Apollo and Reese on this journey from broken to whole, from fear to trust, hit subscribe and join our family. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. Talk to him, Reese instructed. Not commands, not demands, just talk. Tell him something true. What the hell am I supposed to say to a dog? Whatever you'd say to someone you're trying to build trust with. Something honest. Something that doesn't have an agenda attached. Vance was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on Apollo, who remained alert but not defensive. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for family. I don't know how to do this, Vance said finally, his voice rough. The vulnerability thing. I've spent 20 years building armor specifically to avoid it. Vulnerability gets you killed in my world. Gets you exploited, used, destroyed. Apollo's ears rotated forward, tracking the shift in Vance's tone. But you're right that he's suffered enough. Vance continued, the words coming slowly, like he was excavating them from somewhere deep. And maybe Reese is right that love doesn't make you weak. Maybe it just makes you human in a way I've forgotten how to be. Reese stayed very still, barely breathing, watching as something fundamental shifted in the room. Apollo stood slowly, his movements deliberate, and began walking toward Vance. Not the cautious approach he'd made with Reese in their first reunion, but something more confident, assessing but not defensive, curious rather than threatened. Don't move, Reese whispered. Let him come to you on his terms. Vance held perfectly still as Apollo closed the distance to 5 feet. Then 3. Then close enough that Apollo's breath was warm against Vance's face as the dog conducted a thorough olfactory examination. Apollo circled once, his nose working, processing scent markers that told him stories humans couldn't access. Then he sat, directly in front of Vance, close enough to touch, and simply looked at him. Now what? Vance's voice was barely a whisper. Now you wait. He's deciding if you're worth trusting. They held that tableau, man and dog, both scarred in different ways, both trained to violence, both trying to learn a different language, for what felt like an eternity compressed into seconds. This choice would define the rest of his life. Then Apollo leaned forward, very slowly, and rested his massive head on Vance's knee. The sound Vance made was barely audible, something between a gasp and a laugh and possibly a sob compressed into a single exhale. His hand moved without apparent conscious decision, settling on Apollo's head, fingers finding the spot behind his ears that Reese had taught meant safety and affection. Apollo's tail swept once against the floor, then again, a tentative wag that suggested he was remembering what trust felt like, what safety meant, what it was to choose connection instead of isolation. Vance looked up at Reese, and for the first time since she'd met him, his expression was completely unguarded. Wonder, disbelief, something that might have been the beginning of actual emotion breaking through 2 decades of practiced control. He trusts you, Reese said quietly. He trusts you more than he fears you. How is that possible? Vance's voice was rough. I'm everything that's hurt him, everything that's made him into a weapon. No, you're someone who's willing to kneel, to be vulnerable, to show him that power and gentleness can coexist. Reese moved closer, kneeling beside them, creating a small circle of 3 beings trying to learn new ways of existing together. He's not choosing you because you're safe. He's choosing you because you're trying to be safe. That effort matters more than the outcome. Apollo's tail continued its lazy sweep, and he shifted positions slightly, leaning more weight into Vance's touch, as if testing the boundaries of this new connection. Vance's other hand joined the first, both now working through Apollo's fur, finding scars and healing them with touch, offering comfort in a way that suggested he'd forgotten how to give it until this moment. "I didn't think," Vance started, then stopped, swallowed hard. "I didn't think I was capable of this anymore. Of feeling anything that wasn't calculated or strategic or useful. Maybe you just needed someone to trust you enough to let you try," Reese said softly. They stayed like that, kneeling on the floor with a traumatized dog between them, building something fragile and precious, and possibly doomed, but trying anyway. Until Apollo finally stood, licked Vance's hand once, and returned to his bed. Vance remained kneeling, staring at his hand like it belonged to someone else, like the simple act of being licked by a dog had fundamentally altered his understanding of himself. "He trusts you," Reese repeated. "More than he fears you. That's everything." Vance looked at her, and Reese saw something in his eyes that made her chest tighten. Not love. That would be too simple, too quick, too clean for people as damaged as they were. But possibility. The beginning of belief that maybe broken things could be repaired, that maybe trust could be rebuilt, that maybe vulnerability wasn't weakness, but the foundation of anything worth having. "Thank you," Vance said quietly, "for not giving up on him, for showing me how to be this." "Thank you for letting me try," Reese replied. And in the space between them, with Apollo watching from his bed with intelligent eyes that held less trauma and more hope than they had a month ago, something began to shift. Not healing, not yet, but the beginning of it. The first small step toward believing that the future could be something other than a continuation of the past. But there was one thing he didn't know about his closest ally. The investigation began 3 days after Apollo chose to trust Vance. Reese had been granted access to Vance's private office, a space that felt more like a war room than anything civilian, with monitors displaying security feeds, encrypted computers, and filing systems that probably contained enough information to bring down half the city's power structures. "These are the auction records from the purchase," Vance said, sliding a thick folder across the mahogany desk. "Underground transactions don't keep detailed paper trails, but I require verification of provenance for anything I buy." The seller provided documentation claiming Apollo was purpose-bred by a facility in Delaware. Reese opened the folder, her hands trembling slightly as she saw Apollo's photo, the one from the auction listing. All teeth and scars, and barely contained violence. Beneath it was a breeding certificate that looked official enough to fool anyone who wasn't specifically looking for fraud. "This is fake," she said, running her finger along the embossed seal. "The Delaware facility listed here doesn't exist. I checked 6 months ago when I was trying to track him down." "I know. My people verified it after you proved ownership." Vance pulled up information on one of the computer screens. "The certificate is a forgery, very good quality, from a network that specializes in laundering stolen dogs through false documentation, but the seller is real." There was one detail everyone missed. He turned the screen toward her, and Reese felt her blood run cold. The name on the purchase order was Pierce Brandt. "That's..." She looked up at Vance, watching his expression carefully. "That's your director of security." "Yes." Vance's voice was absolutely flat, but his jaw was tight enough to shatter teeth. "Pierce Brandt, the man who's been in charge of my personal protection for 3 years. The man I trusted with access to my home, my schedule, my vulnerabilities." Reese stared at the name, her mind racing. "He stole Apollo from me and sold him to you. He's been working for you for 3 years. Which means he's been in my organization since before he sold me the dog. Which means this wasn't opportunistic theft. Vance's hands curled into fists on the desk. This was calculated. He stole your dog, put him through hell in fighting rings to increase his value, then sold him to me at a premium while working as my employee. Why would he risk that? Because he's running a side business trafficking stolen animals, and I'm a reliable customer who pays well and doesn't ask questions. Vance pulled up more files, and Reese saw a pattern emerging. Other purchases, other purpose-bred dogs, all with similar documentation, all acquired through Pierce. He's been doing this for years, stealing pets, conditioning them into weapons, selling them to wealthy criminals who want protection animals and don't care about provenance. Someone in the room was lying. But who? Rage bloomed in Reese's chest, hot and consuming. How many? At least 40 dogs in the past 5 years, possibly more. Vance's expression was carved from ice. And I've been his unwitting accomplice, providing him with credibility and connections and protection under my organization's umbrella. Reese stood, pacing the office, her hands shaking with the need to hit something. Apollo was 3 months old, a puppy. He took a puppy and turned him into what we found in that room. For money. Just for fucking money. Yes. Vance's voice carried death in it. And he's been collecting a salary from me while doing it. Using my resources. Operating under my protection. Making me complicit in his trafficking operation. What are you going to do? Vance looked at her, and Reese saw something in his eyes that should have terrified her, but instead felt like vindication. I'm going to give you exactly what you asked for. You wanted to look the person who stole Apollo in the eyes and make sure they understood what they took from you. I'm going to arrange that meeting. And then I'm going to make sure Pierce understands what happens to people who betray me, who steal from me, who use my name and my power to hurt innocent things for profit. Vance's voice dropped to something that wasn't quite human. He's going to wish you'd called the police instead. He didn't want revenge. He needed it. Reese should have been horrified, should have insisted on legal justice, proper channels, civilized consequences. But looking at the list of stolen dogs, seeing Apollo's puppy photo next to his auction listing, remembering the scars and the nightmares and the broken creature she'd found in that reinforced cell, civilized consequences felt inadequate. I want to help, she said. This isn't your world, Reese. What I do to traitors isn't something you come back from watching. He stole my puppy. He tortured him. He sold him like property. Reese's voice was steel. I don't care about coming back. I care about making sure he pays for what he did. Vance studied her for a long moment. You're certain? Because once you cross this line, there's no uncrossing it. You'll know exactly what I'm capable of. What I do to people who betray me. And you might not like the person that makes me. I already know what you're capable of, Reese said. I've seen the blood on your shirts, heard the screams from the basement, watched you command an empire built on fear. I'm not naive about who you are. But you haven't seen me enjoy it. Vance's expression was unreadable. You haven't watched me take apart someone who deserves it and recognize that part of me looks forward to it. That scares most people. Seeing that I'm not a monster who does terrible things out of necessity, but someone who sometimes relishes the violence. Then let me be scared, Reese said. After I've looked Pierce in the eyes and made sure he knows exactly what he took from me. What she found in the envelope froze her in place. They stared at each other, and Reese saw Vance making calculations, weighing her resolve against the consequences of involving her in something dark enough to stain her permanently. There's another option, he said finally. We could leak information to the police, let them handle prosecution. It would be cleaner, legal. You wouldn't have to see what I become when someone betrays me this completely. Would he go to prison? Probably. The evidence is substantial. For how long? Animal trafficking? Even with multiple counts, probably 5 to 7 years. Less with good behavior. Reese thought about Apollo's nightmares, the scars, the broken trust that was only now beginning to heal. 7 years of suffering compressed into a sentence measured in the same time frame felt obscene. "No," she said. "Your way. Whatever that means. However dark it gets. He doesn't get to serve a few years and walk free while Apollo lives with the scars forever." Vance nodded slowly. "Then we do this together. But you need to understand. I'm not doing this for justice or vengeance or any noble reason. I'm doing this because Pierce betrayed me, and I make examples of betrayal. The fact that it coincides with your need for closure is convenient, not the motivation." "I don't care about your motivation," Reese said. "I care about the outcome. The outcome will be permanent." Vance's voice carried finality. "Pierce won't walk away from this, won't rebuild his life, won't get a second chance. Are you prepared for that?" Reese thought about Apollo's tail wagging tentatively for the first time in years. Thought about the sound he made when he finally felt safe enough to sleep without nightmares. Thought about the puppy who'd been stolen from her balcony and turned into something the world feared. "Yes," she said. "I'm prepared for that." Vance smiled, and it was the coldest expression Reese had ever seen on a human face. "Then let's arrange a meeting with Pierce. I think it's time he met the owner of one of his trafficking victims." He pulled out his phone and began making calls, and Reese watched the machinery of violence begin to move with the smooth efficiency of something that had been done countless times before. And she felt no guilt, no hesitation, just the cold, clear certainty that sometimes the only appropriate response to cruelty was to make sure it couldn't happen again. Whatever darkness lived in Vance, whatever capacity for violence he possessed, she was about to become complicit in it. And she found she didn't care as much as she thought she should. This was only the beginning of a much bigger war. The warehouse was in a district where buildings went to die. Industrial spaces abandoned when manufacturing moved overseas, leaving behind concrete shells that served as stages for the city's less legal transactions. Vance owned the property through enough shell corporations to make tracking ownership require forensic accounting skills most law enforcement lacked. Reese stood in the shadows of the upper level, watching as Vance's security team positioned themselves around the space with tactical precision. Apollo was beside her, his massive body tense but controlled, responding to her hand signals with the reliability of training layered over instinct. They'd spent the past week preparing for this. Vance had leaked information through his network that a potential buyer wanted to meet Pierce directly. Someone interested in acquiring multiple dogs, willing to pay premium prices for discretion and guaranteed aggression. The kind of client that made Pierce's side business profitable enough to risk operating under Vance's nose. Pierce had taken the bait, probably salivating at a commission that would have been substantial even by his corrupt standards. Now he was walking into a trap, and Reese felt no guilt about the deception. But the real question was, who planned it? The warehouse door opened, and Pierce entered with the confidence of someone who believed he was untouchable. He was exactly what Reese had expected, mid-40s, fit in a way that suggested regular gym time and possibly steroids, wearing expensive but not ostentatious clothing that spoke of success without drawing attention. He looked like someone's favorite uncle, like someone you'd trust to watch your dog while you were on vacation. The kind of monster who hid in plain sight because people couldn't reconcile cruelty with a friendly face. "Mr. Blackwood," Pierce called out, using the false name Vance had provided. "I'm here for our appointment." Reese descended the stairs slowly, Apollo at perfect heel position, his leash loose in her hand. She dressed for the part Vance had created, expensive athletic wear that suggested money and privilege, her hair pulled back severely, dark glasses hiding her eyes. Pierce's expression shifted to professional friendliness as she approached. "Ms. Blackwood," I understand you're interested in acquiring protection animals for multiple properties. I was, Reese said, her voice cold. Until I discovered you're a thief and an animal abuser who's been using your position in Mr. B. Vance's organization to run an illegal trafficking operation. He should have walked away, but then he saw it. Pierce's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: confusion, fear, calculation, and finally settling on false outrage. I don't know what you're talking about. I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding. No misunderstanding. Vance stepped out of the shadows, and the temperature in the warehouse dropped 20 degrees. Just excellent documentation of exactly what you've been doing under my protection. Pierce's face went pale. Boss, I can explain. You stole dogs from their families, tortured them into weapons, sold them to me and others at inflated prices while collecting a salary for loyalty you never had. Vance's voice was absolutely calm, which somehow made it more terrifying. There's nothing to explain, just consequences to deliver. Pierce's hand moved toward his concealed weapon, but Vance's security team materialized from their positions, weapons trained on him with the calm precision of professionals who killed for a living. I wouldn't, Vance said mildly. They're very good at their jobs, and I've given them permission to be creative if you make this difficult. Pierce's hand dropped. His eyes darted around the warehouse, calculating escape routes and finding none. Someone in the room was lying. But who? There's someone who wants to meet you, Vance continued. Someone whose property you stole approximately 7 years ago. Reese removed her dark glasses, and even from across the warehouse, she saw recognition flicker in Pierce's eyes. You, he breathed. The girl with the puppy on Marlowe Avenue. You filed police reports for months. Yes. Reese's voice was steady despite the rage burning through her veins. I filed reports that went nowhere. Searched for a puppy that you'd stolen and sold into hell. Mourned him while you collected profits from his suffering. She signaled Apollo, who moved to her side, his presence commanding enough to make Pierce take an involuntary step backward. You remember him? Reese said. It wasn't a question. You should. You stole him from my balcony, put him through fighting rings, turned him into something that made you $250,000 when you sold him to Mr. Vance. But he had no idea a bigger force was controlling everything. Apollo's growl started low in his chest, a sound that came from somewhere primal and absolute. Not the practiced aggression of fighting rings, but something more personal. Recognition of a specific threat, a specific source of pain. Easy, Reese murmured, but she didn't pull him back. Didn't soften the threat he represented. Pierce was sweating now, his eyes locked on Apollo with the kind of fear that suggested he'd seen exactly what the dog was capable of during the conditioning process. Look, I didn't know he was yours specifically. It was just business. Dogs from good homes make the best fighters because they still have trust to break. It's not personal. It's personal to me, Reese interrupted. Every nightmare he still has, every scar, every moment of fear and pain. It's personal to every family whose pets you stole, to every dog you tortured for profit. Ms. Mitchell has been very patient, Vance said, his voice carrying false reasonableness that was somehow more threatening than rage would have been. Waiting for this meeting, wanting to ensure you understood exactly what you took from her before I address what you took from me. Pierce's eyes darted between them. What do you want? Money? I have accounts. Her next words hit him harder than any bullet. I want you to understand, Reese said, moving closer, Apollo matching her stride, that the puppy you stole wasn't just property. He was my family, the only thing I had left after my grandmother died, and you took him and broke him and sold him like he was nothing. She was close enough now to see Pierce's pupils dilate with fear, close enough to smell his sweat and desperation. I want you to know, she continued, her voice dropping to something almost gentle. That every remaining day of your life, however long Vance decides that should be, you'll remember this moment. You'll remember that your greed and cruelty caught up with you, that you can't hide from consequences forever. Pierce opened his mouth, probably to bargain or threaten or plead, but Reese held up a hand, and suddenly, he realized he was being played. Apollo, she said quietly. Greet. It was a command they'd been working on for weeks, a controlled approach that let Apollo investigate something without aggression. But the target had always been friendly people who Apollo had no history with. Pierce wasn't friendly, and Apollo's memory was better than anyone had given him credit for. The dog moved forward slowly, his approach measured and controlled, nothing like the explosive violence he was capable of. His nose worked, processing scent markers, accessing memories of pain and fear, and hands that had hurt rather than healed. Pierce extended a hand, probably on instinct, the automatic human response to a dog's approach, and Apollo's demeanor changed in an instant. The growl that erupted wasn't the practiced sound of a fighting dog. It was personal. Recognition and rage and years of trauma crystallizing into a sound that made even Vance's hardened security team shift uncomfortably. He remembers you, Reese said, pulling Apollo back before the situation could escalate to actual violence. Specifically, not just as a threat, but as the source of specific pain. You didn't just steal him. You broke him. And he knows it was you. Pierce was shaking now, his professional composure completely shattered by a dog's personal vendetta. Reese turned to Vance. I'm done. Whatever you need to do next, I don't need to see it. Vance nodded, something like approval in his eyes. Take Apollo home. I'll handle this. He didn't want revenge. He needed it. Reese walked toward the exit, Apollo at her heel, leaving Pierce to face whatever consequences Vance had designed. She didn't look back, didn't need to see violence to know it was coming. Behind her, she heard Vance's voice, cold and final. For the record, Pierce, what's about to happen isn't business. It's personal. Very personal. The warehouse door closed behind her, muffling whatever Pierce was saying in response. Reese stood in the evening air, breathing deeply. Apollo pressed against her leg in the way that meant he was seeking comfort rather than providing it. It's over, she whispered, scratching behind his ears. He can't hurt you or anyone else ever again. Apollo's tail wagged, tentative but real, and Reese felt something release in her chest. Not healing. Not yet, maybe not ever completely, but the beginning of it. The first step toward believing that justice could exist, even in a world as dark as the one Vance inhabited. She didn't know what happened in that warehouse after she left. She didn't ask. Some questions were better left unanswered, some consequences better left unwitnessed, some darkness better left in the shadows where it belonged. All she knew was that 3 days later, Pierce Brandt's name disappeared from every system, every database, every record, and Apollo's nightmares began to decrease. That was enough. Everyone thought the deal went smoothly, but they were wrong. 2 months after Pierce's disappearance, Vance called Reese to his office. She entered to find blueprints spread across every available surface, detailed architectural plans for a facility that looked more like a luxury resort than anything she'd expected. "What is this?" she asked, studying the layout. Veterinary suites, training areas, rehabilitation spaces, housing that looked designed for maximum comfort and minimum stress. "The Pierce Brandt Memorial Animal Sanctuary," Vance said, and there was dark humor in his tone. "Though we'll be using a different name publicly. Something less likely to raise questions about where Pierce went." Reese stared at him. "You're building an animal sanctuary?" With Pierce's seized assets, yes. He'd accumulated approximately $4.7 million over the years through his trafficking operation. Money he made from stolen animals and their suffering. Vance pulled up financial documents. I'm using every penny to create something that will help traumatized animals recover. Full veterinary care, behavioral rehabilitation. Eventually, careful adoption placement for animals that can be safely integrated into homes. This single decision gave him the upper hand again. Reese struggled for words. That's actually beautiful. It's strategic, Vance corrected, but his tone suggested he didn't quite believe his own deflection. Animals like Apollo need specialized care. Creating a facility that can provide it makes sense, and using Pierce's money to do it feels appropriately ironic. Reese moved closer to the blueprints, seeing details that spoke of genuine understanding. Outdoor spaces designed to reduce anxiety. Indoor areas structured for privacy and security. Protocols that prioritized animal well-being over human convenience. You've been researching, she said. I've been reading the books you recommended, and consulting with veterinary behaviorists, and possibly becoming slightly obsessed with animal rehabilitation theory. Vance's expression was carefully neutral. Apollo's not the only animal that deserves better than what the world gave him. Reese felt something warm bloom in her chest. Something dangerous and hopeful and possibly doomed, but trying anyway. He knew something that no one else in the building did. There's one more thing, Vance said, pulling out a formal-looking document. I need someone to run this facility. Someone who understands traumatized animals. Who's proven they can rehabilitate even the most damaged cases. Who gives a damn about outcomes instead of optics. He slid the document across the desk, and Reese saw her name on an employment contract that made her current salary look like pocket change. You want me to run the sanctuary? Her voice came out barely above a whisper. I want you to design it, build it, and run it. Full autonomy. Budget that's functionally unlimited within reason. Authority to hire staff, set protocols, determine which animals are accepted and which are beyond help. Vance's eyes were serious. You'd be a partner, not an employee. Equal say in how this operates. Reese looked from the contract to the blueprints to Vance, trying to process the enormity of what he was offering. Why? She asked. This is more than just making use of seized assets. This is genuine investment in something that doesn't benefit you directly. Doesn't it? Vance's voice was quiet. Apollo's getting better. His nightmares are decreasing. He trusts me now, which is something I didn't think was possible. And that's because you refused to accept that he was too broken to save. He paused. Maybe I'm investing in the possibility that other broken things can be saved too. Maybe that benefits me more than you realize. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for family. They looked at each other across the desk, and Reese saw the truth he wasn't quite saying. This wasn't just about Apollo or the sanctuary or seized assets. This was about Vance trying to be something other than what he'd always been, trying to create something that healed instead of harmed. Trying to prove that people who'd done terrible things could still choose to do better. I have one condition, Reese said. Of course you do. Vance's smile was genuine, reaching his eyes in a way she rarely saw. What is it? Apollo comes with me, the sanctuary's first resident. He helps rehabilitate other dogs by showing them what recovery looks like. He's already yours, Vance said. The ownership papers were transferred to your name 3 weeks ago. I just haven't told you yet. Reese's eyes filled with tears. You gave him back to me. I returned stolen property to its rightful owner. Vance's voice was careful, but his expression was soft. Though I reserve the right to visit, he's taught me things about trust and vulnerability that I apparently needed to learn. This choice would define the rest of his life. You can visit whenever you want, Reese said, signing the contract without reading the details because the details didn't matter as much as the opportunity. As long as you remember what he taught you. That vulnerability isn't weakness. That love makes you stronger than control ever could. Vance stood, moving around the desk, And for the first time since she'd met him, he pulled Reese into an embrace that had nothing to do with strategy or manipulation or power dynamics. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion he rarely let surface. "For not giving up on him. For showing me what's possible when you choose healing over revenge." "We didn't choose healing over revenge," Reese corrected, returning the embrace. "We chose both. And sometimes broken people need to see justice done before they can start to heal." They stood like that. Two damaged people who'd found purpose in saving a damaged dog, building something beautiful from the ashes of something terrible. Until Apollo's distinctive whine came from the doorway. For once, he wasn't thinking like a boss, but like a man about to lose everything. He'd followed Reese to the office, his presence more confident now, his body language suggesting curiosity rather than threat assessment. Vance and Reese broke apart, and Apollo moved between them, his massive head nudging Vance's hand in a gesture that was pure affection, no fear or wariness attached. "Hey boy," Vance said, kneeling to Apollo's level with the automatic ease of someone who'd learned that vulnerability was strength. "You're going to have a whole sanctuary of friends soon. Other dogs who need to learn what you're learning. Think you can handle that?" Apollo's tail wagged with the enthusiasm that had taken months to recover, and he licked Vance's face with the uncomplicated joy of a dog who'd finally remembered that humans could be trusted. Reese knelt beside them, creating a small circle of three beings who'd been broken in different ways but were healing together, building something that would help others heal too. "We're going to call it Second Chances," Reese said, looking at the blueprints with new understanding. "Because that's what we're giving these animals, and maybe what we're giving ourselves." Vance's hand found hers, his grip firm and warm and carrying the weight of promises that had nothing to do with contracts or business arrangements. "Second chances," he agreed. "For all of us." Apollo rested his head in Reese's lap, his body relaxed in a way that would have been impossible 2 months ago. His trust given freely because he'd finally learned that some humans were worth the risk. And in that moment, kneeling on the floor of a Mafia boss's office, planning a sanctuary built from blood money and bitter justice, with a dog who'd survived hell sleeping peacefully between them, Reese felt something she hadn't felt in 7 years. Hope. Not the desperate, grasping hope that denied reality, but the quiet, solid hope that came from seeing broken things begin to heal. From watching love prove stronger than violence. From building futures on foundations of fierce, protective devotion instead of fear. Apollo's breathing slowed into sleep, and Reese and Vance remained kneeling beside him, their hands joined across his scarred body, making silent promises to the animal who'd saved them both by letting them save him. Outside the office windows, the city continued its relentless pace, violent and beautiful and terrible and full of second chances for those brave enough to take them. And inside, 3 broken things became whole, one breath at a time, one moment of trust at a time, one choice to heal instead of hurt at a time. Building sanctuary from suffering, creating family from fragments, proving that love, in the end, was always stronger than the forces that tried to destroy it.